Okay, everybody, we're going to start and review for our first test. Remember, there are several different topics on it. Of course, we begin with the characteristics of life, cell theory, all of our scientists that contributed to the cell theory. We looked at organization, cell differentiation, and then last, remember, we looked at viruses. So let's just start with the characteristics of life. The first one is that all living things are made of one or more cells. And remember that this is the characteristic that gets the viruses. And remember, we said today that the viruses are not part of the living world. And this is the major reason why. Viruses can do many things that living things can do if they're in a cell, but that's the whole catch 22. They don't have their own cells. So if you have one cell, remember you're unicellular, many cell, you're multicellular. And remember, when we look at organisms that are multicellular, those cells are different from each other. And that's where the concept of cell differentiation came in. I showed you this picture here. So this kind of plays into that. This is another characteristics of life, growth and development. We talked about how after fertilization, we have these cells that are called stem cells that quickly form. And remember, once this fertilization occurs, we get a zygote, and then the zygote divides. So one cell divides into two, and two into four, which is what you see here, until we get a whole ball of cells, which is what we see in this picture. This is called a blastocyst, and you can see that every single cell in this picture looks alike. And so, again, these are stem cells. So these are stem cells, these are stem cells. But when development continues, we see that we turn into something that looks like a baby. And so you can see here that this little fetus has many different types of cells because you can already see the development of several of the organs. So up here is going to be the brain. You can see here is going to be probably the eyes, and then definitely here is the spine. And so these organs are made of different types of tissues. So what took us from here to here is the fact that we are turning different genes on and off in the cells. So every cell that is in this fetus has the same genes and the same DNA. They're just using the genes differently. So, for example, in this spinal tissue, we may have certain genes that are turned on that are turned off in maybe the skin tissue. And so that continues throughout. And even as, growing young people like you or adults like me, our bodies are still producing stem cells. So when we make new skin, they start out as a skin stem cell that's going to turn into that, full grown adult skin cell. Okay. So just going back a second, next characteristic is that all living things have DNA. And of course, the DNA code is universal. So that, of course, is going to be found in their nucleus. And then just going back a second, all living things are going to reproduce. And they can reproduce asexually or sexually. Of course, remember, sexual reproduction is better because the reproduction is the result of having two parents with two different sets of DNA. So that combines to make unique and individual offspring, children, whatever you want to call them. Okay, so the next characteristic of life is that all living things have to make energy for themselves. And I think I told you this on the first day of class. So life is based on the ability to keep your cells going, and cells go and do work with energy, just like anything else. So if you lose the ability to make energy for yourself, you die, right? And so the energy is going to come from some type of food, whether it is eaten or made. So that's where we have the difference in the autotrophs and the heterotrophs. But regardless, if you take some source of chemical energy and you turn it into physical energy, ATP, well, it's really another type of chemical energy, then that's considered one of the metabolic processes. So make sure you know the term metabolism. And here's just a little bit more about heterotrophs, which of course are consumers. Living things respond to their environment. So remember, we're responding to a stimulus. Think of a response as a reaction. And so response helps us to maintain homeostasis, which is our next characteristic. So, even in this last statement here, it says internal stimuli come from within, such as blood sugar level or feeling thirsty. So, for example, if you are dehydrated, then your body's going to respond to that dehydration and make you feel thirsty so that you will drink. And when you drink, that's going to bring you back to homeostasis because, as you know, we have to have a certain amount of water in our body. Another example of homeostasis is maintaining a constant body temperature, maintaining constant blood pressure. Remember, we said that doctors basically check for homeostasis. Last characteristic is that all living things are going to evolve. Remember, you do not evolve in your lifetime. You're born with your adaptation. And so that adaptation is either good or bad. And if it's good, then of course it helps you live. And if you can live, then you can pass it on to future generations. Okay. Then after that, we moved into cell theory. And there are three basic principles of the cell theory. And the cell theory was developed by a number of scientists, really, that just kind of all put their 2 cents in, starting, of course, here in the mid 1600s. Remember, the first guy that kind of came on the scene with helping getting the cell theory off the ground was Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was the one that looked at cork. He came up with the idea of cells, and then, of course, he named cells. Then, of course, the next guy was Leeuwenhoek, and he lived about the same time. He was the first one to observe living cells. And so this is what Hooke looked at up here. This is what Leeuwenhoek looked at. So this is a protist down here. He saw that in pond water. So here's Hooke, here's Leeuwenhoek, here's his microscope. Remember, he held it up to his eye and looked through the lens like that. So very different. Then we moved on to the two guys that helped us to understand that all living things were made of cells. And so the first was Schleiden, and Schleiden was a botanist, which meant he studied plants, and so he said plants are made of cells. Then you have Schwann. Schwann was a zoologist, and he said that animals were made of cells. So remember that Schwann goes with animals because the swan is an animal, and so don't forget to put that little thing together. And then Virchow simply said that cells come from other cells. So he said that spontaneous generation does not exist, that you have to have a cell in order to get another one. So here are the three principles of the cell theory. All living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic units of life or basic units of structure and function, and cells come from other cells. Okay, so we didn't really go into this too much other than saying that there are many organisms that are only made of one cell, so that would be bacteria. And then, of course, we have many organisms like us that are made of many. Okay. Next, we move on to organization. And so, organization is basically how an organism is put together. It's just like the building blocks of an organism. So, the most complex level is organism. The least complex level is either cells, or remember, I told you to even add chemicals or macromolecules to that. So basically how it works, if you put like cells together, cells that look alike and function in the same way, you get a tissue. If you put more than one type of tissue together in a single structure, you get an organ. If you put more than one type of organ together and they function together, you get an organ system. And then you put all the organ systems together and you get an organism. So we played this sorting game in class with this. So we'll just go through a couple of the pictures. You should be familiar with this. Remember, this is a cell. The cell is just one thing. You can see it has a nucleus. So we're looking at one thing. Now over in this picture, we see lots of cells. So when you see lots of cells and they all look alike, this is what's going to constitute a tissue. So we have one cell here. We have a lot of them put together here in our tissue. Same thing with this. This is muscle tissue. So you can see the nuclei of the muscle cells. They all look alike. you really can't tell what this is from this picture. So you may not know that this was taken from a bicep or a tricep or a quadricep or something like that because we don't really see that yet. All we see is the group of cells. So this is a tissue. Now over here is a system. Why? Because you see two organs, brain and spinal cord. Same thing here. This is a system. We have small intestine and large intestine. Where over here, this is an organ. It's just a single heart, but it's made of multiple types of tissues. So when you think about cells and organs, you're going to be thinking or seeing one thing: a heart, a cell, a kidney, a leaf even, okay? With systems, you're going to see multiple things. So here you see small intestine and large intestine. With tissues, you're going to see multiple cells. So we have cell, lots of cells there. Okay. Same thing here. This is the tissue because you see lots of the same tissue. Here is the system because this is the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So you have 3 organs there. Same thing here. You've got 2 organs, lungs and heart. So this is a system as well. This would be a single organ because it's just one structure and it does have different kinds of tissue. So you can see even in this picture the different layers. So you can see the inside lining and you can see the muscle part of the stomach. So that's one organ. This is a cell. We see it's one thing. We've got the nucleus in the middle. Okay. This is another cell and this is a cell. This one looks a little bit different, but don't let that fool you. Okay. And here's a system because you see the lungs, the trachea, sinus cavities, all that stuff together. And then, of course, the brain is a single organ. This is a cell, and this is an organ. Okay, so just keep those in mind. Remember, you're going to have to apply this knowledge, so just make sure you can pick out and you understand the differences in those. Okay. Next, we're going to move on quickly to viruses. So earlier I mentioned that viruses are not part of the living world. They're just basically little opportunists. They are infectious particles. They're not plants, they're not animals, they don't belong in any of the kingdoms. They have very unique structure, so you can see all these different shapes of the viruses. Here's the T2 that y'all built in class, but you see that that's not the only shape that we have. So viruses, they're only made of 2 things. They're made of protein and then a nucleic acid, which will either be DNA or RNA. Okay, so that's all that they're made of. The protein is on the outside. The nucleic acid, their DNA, is going to be on the inside. They do not have their own cell. So this is not a cell. This is not a cell membrane. Okay, this is just a little infectious particle. Viruses, we said, could have the DNA or the RNA. You don't have to know this term retrovirus, but you do need to understand that the virus is basically a parasite. The cell that it infects is a host cell. Okay, so here again, this is our bacteriophage. So that means that this is a virus, because that's what phage is, that infects bacteria. So this is obviously going to be a lot smaller than a bacteria. And again, this is not a membrane. This is just protein on the outside. The DNA or the RNA is the inside. Same thing here. The deal with the virus is that it has to bind to the cell that it's going to infect. So, we're exposed to many different viruses, but they don't all make us sick. And the ones that make us sick are the ones that can actually bind to our cells and put their DNA inside of our cells. Okay. This is how the virus is going to replicate. So again, it has to attach to the cell. It has to stick to it, basically. Once it sticks to the cell, and this is a bacteria, it's going to inject its DNA into the cell. Once it does, the viral DNA takes over and turns this host cell into a virus factory. So when the virus infected cell fills up with new viruses, it's simply going to explode. All of these viruses are going to be released to go attack other cells. So that's kind of why when you get sick with viruses, it makes you feel pretty bad pretty fast. This is just showing us how the virus is going to attach to the host cell. So you can see how this little structure looks like it's going to fit into this one, and it does. So up here's the virus, here's the cell. It has to fit into it. And that's the same thing that this is showing. The cell has to have something on the outside of it, the host cell, that the virus can stick to before it can go into the cell. Okay? Things that you have heard of that are caused by viruses: warts, just the common cold, which is rhinovirus, the influenza virus, which we know a lot about. Many of you had the flu last year. Smallpox, we mentioned Ebola, herpes, which causes fever blisters, the HIV virus, which causes AIDS, chickenpox, even rabies. Those are all caused by viruses. And viruses, many of them, they can be prevented with a vaccine. So just like the flu shot, that's what you're getting, is a vaccination to keep you from getting the flu. But once you get the flu, remember, you cannot take an antibiotic to treat it. Antibiotics treat bacteria only. They don't treat viruses. Okay? So again, here's just some examples of different types of viruses that you have heard of and what they look like. This is a good slide. This gives us some info on the virus in a cell. So a virus is made of some DNA or RNA and protein, where the living cell has a lot more. Many of you asked me what an organelle was today on the quiz, or yesterday on the quiz. An organelle is one of the things that's inside of the cell. So the nucleus is an organelle, is a cell organelle. The mitochondria is a cell organelle. Chloroplast is a cell organelle. But remember, viruses don't have those. Viruses are going to replicate, but only with the host cell. They cannot replicate by themselves out in the living world. They have to have a host cell. But living cells, of course, they can. They can replicate all by themselves because they have all the machinery. Viruses are going to have DNA or RNA, either or. Living cells are going to have both. And then look here, all the other characteristics of life. Viruses, no growth, no development, no metabolism, no response, no evolution. Okay, where living cells, yes. Okay, now viruses can mutate. So when the virus moves from one organism to another, when it's, I should say one cell to another, when that viral DNA is being copied inside of the host cell, now it can mutate, and we can end up with different strains, and that's why they have to redo the flu shot every year, and that's why sometimes the flu shot doesn't work, because the virus is mutated by the time everybody starts getting sick. So what you got to know, viruses are not alive. The end. No, not alive. Okay, folks, that's it. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. There is a review page on Canvas. Please use it. Please study the quizzes. Make sure if you didn't do well on the vocabulary quiz that you go back and you memorize that, because, I told y'all what the class average was. If you score below the class average, then we need to make sure that we do something tonight or tomorrow night, depending on when your test is, to get you up to at least that point. Okay, and you can do it. It's just going to take a little bit of work. Make sure you bring your guided note sheet to class. I will take that up. Okay, so I hope y'all have a great night or day whenever you're watching this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me a message, and I will be glad to help you. Okay.